analysis of the trajectories of immigrant women labor force participation in the United States, paying attention to differences by country of origin and how it evolves over time. Just as a brief introduction, I think it's fair to say that the literature on immigrant, especially the literature on immigrant economic assimilation, still remain focused on men. Migration continues to be perceived as, especially international migration, as a male dominating phenomenon, and women for the longest time has been reconstructed as secondary workers, which were, when they migrate, it was driven by family reunification, even though there is considerable variation behind the motivation for women's migration. More recent scholarship has been challenging this view. There has been increasing recognition of the size and importance of female migration in migration flows. There's evidence that women, when they migrate, there's also an economic motivation behind their migration. Still, immigrant women's economic contribution have not been systematically incorporated into our theories and analysis of immigrant incorporation. Even when women migrate as secondary migrants following their spouses, they still work and contribute to the family economy. And for the longest time, we have seen assimilation just viewed from an individual perspective, even though there's increasing recognition that's more of a household decision and not just individual. Just to give you a little bit of a background and to justify the analysis, there have been two salient trends affecting women in the US. The first one is a general trend that there has been a dramatic increase in female labor force participation starting around the second half of the 20th century. By the late 1980s, the labor force participation rate for US-born women aged 25 and 54 surpassed 70%. So there has been a massive incorporation of women into the labor market. And there has been a significantly narrow difference between labor force participation of men and women, and things are actually changing even today. Labor force participation and work more generally has been a driving force and a marker of female independence. Economic independence is at the root of women gaining power in relationships and gaining power in decision making. And this has been especially the case for married women with children. At the same time, this is more recently, there has been a dramatic increase in international migration to the US. Between 1960 and 2015, the foreign-born population in the US rose from 9.7 to over 40 million immigrants. And even though there is variation by country of origin, nearly half of immigrants to the US are women. So women have always participated in international migration to the US. Foreign-born women, and especially their economic contributions, should be central for understanding immigrant incorporation, but they have not received the attention that the process deserves. So the main objective is to examine patterns of immigrants' women's workforce incorporation by national origin and how they change with time in the US. I'm going to focus primarily just on being in the labor force. I'm going to analyze overall national origin disparities in labor force participation, and I'm going to highlight differences when people arrive to the US and the first years in the US, their trajectories with time in the US and how it evolves over time, and have the extent to which they converge across these different national origin groups and what it tells us about the role of women for understanding different assimilation of national origin groups. I'm also going to examine the extent to which the variation in these trajectories by national origin can be explained by individual level characteristics, mainly human capital and family characteristics. And also I'm going to pay attention to gender specific cohort characteristics upon arrival. I'm going to talk more about that, about the conditions under which women arrive to the US as a function of patterns across national origin groups. Just to just to the theoretical background that justifies the model that I'm proposing, it builds on two literatures. One is the determinants of female labor force participation, and there's a long tradition of stressing the importance of human capital resources for explaining the likelihood of women working. Issues such as age, education affect the likelihood of being participating in the labor force. And also there's a central role is to family structure. Being married and with children has been considered obstacle to female labor force participation, and I'm going to assess that in the case of immigrant women. In the case of immigrants, other important things to consider are English language ability. That has been an obstacle for labor force participation of immigrants, and this can be particularly important for women. Also, the likelihood of working is expected to vary with time in the US. And here I'm going to stress not just time in the US as a linear pattern, but differences at arrival. When women are in the first 2 years of being in the US, in the midterm period in the US between 3-10 years, and the longer term period, and see how this changes with time in the US. I'm also going to pay attention to age at arrival, because when people arrive to the US can have an effect on their chances of finding work or their willingness to be in the labor force. I'm also, the literature on immigrant incorporation has been stressing the importance of context of origin and reception for understanding the prospects for immigrant incorporation of assimilation. In terms of, here I'm comparing different national origin groups. They have different migration histories. They have different degrees of selectivity. Some national origin groups can arrive to the US with much higher levels of education than others. They come with the arrival conditions. Sometimes women arrive married with children already. And so I'm going to pay attention to issues of the selectivity of the migrant flow that are pretty much determined by processes in the context of origins. But I'm also going to stress the context of reception characteristics. In general, the literature has paid attention to issues such as the size of the ethnic community or policy considerations that affect the differences across national origin groups in terms of their economic incorporation. Here I'm going to make the case that we need to think about a dimension that can be specific for understanding gender experiences, factors that can really affect women when they arrive to the US. And I'm going to pay attention to the gender characteristics of the migration flow. I'm going to incorporate in the model things that characteristics of the different national origin groups. The first one is the gender ratio at arrival. The ratio of men to women when for those with 1 to 2 years in the US. The different gender composition of the flow is a reflection of what kind of demand processes are attracting people to the US. The most dramatic example is Mexican migration to the US, that especially at the beginning tends to be male dominated because of the jobs that the US demands tend to be really male dominated jobs, and so the US recruits Mexican men, and there is an overrepresentation of Mexican men relative to women at the early when they arrive to the US. I'm also going to pay attention to marital status at arrival, basically the percent arriving single, because it also reflects the extent to which migration is undertaken by women, single women in search of economic opportunities. It can be in those cases where women are more likely to arrive single, then migration contributes to female independence, and it might create a context for different proportions in terms of participating in the labor force. I'm also going to pay attention to men's educational qualifications. Basically, the proportion of men arriving with college education. The male resources affect women's propensity to work, and this also connects with the demand for workers and the extent to which immigrant women can depend or not on the work of immigrant men, especially in the case of women arriving married or following their husbands. The extent of male qualification might either encourage or discourage women from working, since women could depend on men's income for being in the U.S. The data for the analysis come from the decennial censuses of 1990 and 2000, and the American Community Survey. I used the 5 years, 2006, 2010, 2012, 2016. The sample is restricted to foreign-born women in the ages 16 to 54 who are not living in group quarters and also are not in school. So these are women who could participate in the labor force. I restrict the sample to those arriving in the 1990s, 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. So I'm not going to pay attention to differences between arriving before 1965 or after 1965. And I'm also restricting the sample to women who migrated after age 15, who so part of the, they're likely to be in the labor force. The analytic strategy, ideally, you will have longitudinal data to look at this, but here I'm going to follow synthetic cohorts. I'm constructing synthetic cohorts. There's a increasing recognition that to understand immigrant incorporation, you really need to take a cohort perspective. You need to follow the same cohorts over time, ideally the same people over time. Cross-sectional analysis of the foreign-born population do not always provide a very accurate representation about how things change with time in the US. And this has been registered, for instance, in studies of conversions in wages between immigrants and natives, where the cross-sectional analysis and the cohort analysis gives you a different picture of what happens in terms of conversions. I'm going to follow national origin cohorts and at different age of arrivals for every 5 year groups, and for different periods of arrivals, those 1980, 1990s, and 2000s. And so I construct these cohorts and I follow them synthetically over time. For instance, Mexican women arriving at ages 20 to 24 in 1980 are going to be 30 to 34 years old in 1990, and I'm going to follow 40, and I'm going to be 40 to 44-year-old in 2000. So I compare those different age groups over time, and they reflect different times in the US for the same immigrant arriving cohort. The limiting assumption here is that we don't know if they are the same women, and some of the findings can be affected by return migration, and it's an issue that's is difficult to overcome. And the model specification, the dependent variable is being in the labor force. The explanatory, which is a dummy variable, 0 to 1. The explanatory variables, I construct national origin or regional origin groups. Europe is going to be the reference. Then I have immigrants from Africa, China, Vietnam, Canada, Mexico, Central America, South America, Cuba, India, Korea, other Asian countries, Caribbean, and the Philippines. So I have a large number of national origin groups, and this is why census data and the American Community Surveys allows you to disaggregate these many different national origin groups. It's something that you cannot easily do with longitudinal surveys or with other data sources. I also construct age at arrival groups, five-year groups of age at arrival, period of arrival, like I mentioned before, 1980s, 1990, and 2000. Years in the US, I specified as a spline, which is the arrival years when they have been here for 1 to 2 years, medium term years, which are 3 to 10 years, and long term in the US, which people who have been 11 plus year in the US, and this is constructed as a spline where they're all connected over time. I also control for education attainment, which is less than high school, some college and college, English ability, whether they had trouble speaking English. Family structure includes being married and having children under the age of 5 in the household. Since I'm going to be relying on interactions, the model is estimated with a linear probability model with cluster standard errors for the different cohorts. So let me illustrate what the dependent variable looks like and the trajectories over time. This is what the trajectories of the synthetic cohorts for European immigrants according to different age at arrivals. I'm going to start with the black line here, which is the likelihood of being in the labor force, the proportion of women in the labor force for US born whites. US born whites, you see, is slightly under 80%. It reaches 80% for ages 25 to 29, but it's very close to 80%. And so one of the things to keep in mind is the extent to which immigrant women reach the level of labor force participation that you see for US born whites. And this is what happens to the experience of European immigrants. These are the first group, this light blue group, is women arriving at ages 15, 19. They arrive 15, 19, and then you follow them you follow this cohort by 20 to 24. They reach 70%, and then slowly increases with time in the US, and it reaches the same level that you see for US born whites by age 40 to 44, but very quickly they converge with whites. And women arriving 20 to 24, they start lower, slightly higher than this group, but they start lower than those who have been in the US already for 5 years, but then it slowly increases and it converges with whites. Those who arrive 20 to 25, 25 to 29, again, when they arrive, they start lower, they start increasing, and then they converge. 30 to 34, they start even lower when they arrive, but then very quickly converge. So I'm going to be looking at how these patterns look by different national origin groups. Here are two other salient cases in the analysis. One is the experience of Mexican women and Filipino women. Mexican women, almost irrespective of age at arrival, they exhibit very low, relatively low levels of labor force participation, and compared to US born whites or compared to European immigrants. When Mexican women arrive to the US, around 50% is in the labor force. Then really it doesn't go up until ages 35 to 39, 40 to 44, which coincides when they're done with taking care of children and their family responsibilities decline. And whereas for the European case, it increased very rapidly. For the Mexican case, it's much slower, and it never reaches 80%, as we saw in the European case or with US born white women. And actually for some groups, those arriving later, there's a gap and things don't converge very well. Filipino women are another, is the opposite. It's an extreme example in the other direction. Filipino women, as soon as they arrive to the US, they are working at rates comparable to what we see among US-born women or European women. And actually, after some time in the US, Filipinas are more likely to work than Europeans and US-born white women. And so they are very quickly get incorporated into the labor market, and they participate at a very high rate. Obviously, you can see where I'm going here about the difference in the processes attracting Mexican women and Filipino women to the US. Filipino women are actively recruited in industries primarily nursing, and they actually come to work in the US, where Mexican women, the labor demand for Mexican immigrants is primarily for men, and so their labor force participation is very different from what you see for Filipino women. These are the two other different cases. Indian women exhibit very low levels of labor force participation when they arrive to the US, very low, and even lower than Mexican women. And but it grows very rapidly, and it reaches, for those who arrive at a relatively young age, it reaches 80% by 40 to 45. So they converge with US-born white women or with European immigrants, and it's really negatively affected by time of migration. But the interesting pattern is they have very low levels of labor force participation when they arrive. Caribbean women are more similar to what we see with the Filipino women. They also exhibit very high levels of labor force participation immediately after arriving to the US, and it grows very consistently with time in the US. And again, they're working at a higher rate than US-born white women. So since we have a large number of countries and regions, we conducted some group-based trajectory models to actually group these patterns of arrival and trajectories over time, and we constructed 5 different immigrant women's labor force trajectories. The first one, we call it is the gradual incorporation, which includes Europe, Africa, China, Vietnam, and Canada, and they start at average levels of labor force participation and slowly increase, and I think they tend to converge with whites. The second group is, we call the delay incorporation. It's really one country here. It's just Mexico. It has very low levels at arrival, and then it increases very slowly, and it's only at the end that really labor force participation increases. And then we have we call it delay because it's really slow changes over time, but it starts at a much higher level at arrival. This includes the countries in Central America, South America, and Cuba. And then we have this interesting case, which is, we call it an accelerated labor force incorporation, which is Indian, Korean, and other Asian women, that they start very, very low, comparable to Mexicans, but it grows very rapidly, and then it continues growing. And then we have a very, the final is, we call it like intensive labor force incorporation trajectories, immigrant women who participate at every stage at a very high rate in the labor force. And this actually gives you the proportions for the different groups. So you see, for the gradual incorporation, they start working around 57–60% when they arrive. It goes to 69, and it reaches close to 80% by after many years in the US. Mexican women, they start a much lower level of 45%, and it barely changes in the middle years, and then increases in later years after many years in the US. Central American women, they start higher, 60%, but then the change is relatively slow compared to what we see in the European changes but they still make improvement. And they accelerated. They start 35% of labor force participation, lower than Mexicans, but then it jumps 20% just after 2 years, and then it reaches 69 and 70% after many years. Caribbeans, they start much higher than any other group, and Filipino women the same thing, and it maintains very high levels of labor force participation. Overall, it's important to know that in all cases, labor force participation increases with time in the US. So for understanding immigrant assimilation and incorporation more generally, the economic contribution of immigrant women, even though it's variable and there is difference across countries, is increasingly with time in the US, is increasingly part of the migration experience. So understanding the incorporation of immigrant groups needs to pay attention to the economic contributions of women. And I'm going to report now the descriptive statistics for the main variables and the human capital variables, the selectivity of the flow, who is arriving to the US. The gradual incorporation tends to be a group of women with very high levels of education, except for the case of Vietnamese women that have 10 years of education, but on average, they have 14 years of education when they arrive to the US. They tend to speak English relatively well, and except for the case of China and Vietnam, and in the sample, they're likely to be married, and this is the proportion with children. Mexican women, on the other hand, arrive with relatively low levels of education, and they're not very likely to speak English, and they have higher proportion with children in the family. Central American women they have relatively low levels of education comparable to Mexican women, and South American women and Cuban women have higher levels of education, not as high as European immigrants, and so those attributes facilitate their labor force participation. Indian and Korean women, if you might recall, that they actually do not work immediately after arriving to the US, but they have very high levels of education, even higher in some cases than European immigrants, and they're very lucky to speak English, but their trajectories are sort of unique and not always reflecting of these education endowments when they arrive. Caribbean women and Filipino women are also highly qualified, and they do come to work, and their education translates into early labor force incorporation. So you see how these patterns correspond to that. When we look at the gender composition of the migration flow and how it might affect these trajectories, the first is the sex ratio, is the number of men divided by the number of women. So when it's over 1, you have more men than women in the flow. So Africa tends to have an overrepresentation of men, Europe is pretty even. China actually has an overrepresentation of women, Vietnamese too. Mexico is pretty extreme case of an overrepresentation of men, and Central America also overrepresented men, Indian too, and the opposites in Korea and in the Philippines. Studies of women's labor force incorporation and how they do in the US have stressed the importance of networks for understanding the ability to find jobs, look for opportunities, who to talk to, and so forth. So the gender composition of the flow is indirectly a measure of the network of resources that women can tap on, or to the extent that they depend on men, and that this might affect their chances of finding work in the US. The percent single, again, is a measure to what extent women just come to the US for work. In the case of Vietnam, there's a high proportion of women migrating single. It's also high in Central America, in Caribbean. In the case of India, actually, it's very unlikely that women will arrive to the US single for Indian women. In terms of the educational qualifications of men, close to 50% of men and in Europe, Africa, and China actually have college education. It's very low in Vietnam and Canada. It's really very low in Mexico. So Mexican women technically cannot always rely on men for income. It's low in Central America and Cuba. In the case of India, Indian women arrive with following their spouses, and 70% of the Indian men arriving to the US arrive to the US with college education. It's also very high among Korean women and among other Asian women. It tends to be low among Caribbean women and low among the Philippines. And these are factors that affect, these are gender cohort characteristics that affect labor market trajectories. So these are the results of the models that pretty much summarize what I was talking about. The first three columns estimate the models without controls for socioeconomic characteristics and human capital characteristics. So we see there's little differences within the gradual model group, and they participate and around 60% when they arrive. It increases with time in the US and increases for everybody. It tends to increase more rapid for European women than for other women, but it tends to increase with time in the US. When we control for socioeconomic characteristics, actually this is a group that has high levels of education. So when you apply the average levels of education for all immigrants, actually the labor force participation would have been higher than without controls. But again, it continues to increase with time in the US. It's just at the end, just basically stabilizes. So again, this captures that, and the proportion would even be higher if they had the average education of all immigrants. In the case of Mexico, they are less likely to work when they arrive. Their labor force participation actually does not increase with time in the US, which again, this is the pattern of delayed incorporation. It only increases after 11 years in the US, but Mexican women arrive at very low levels and they remain at very low levels for many years. Socioeconomic characteristics explain a lot of this difference, but not everything. Around half of this disadvantage of Mexican women gets explained by education and family background characteristics, both in terms of arriving and the period in the US, but it's not completely explained by human capital characteristics. Central American women actually work at a higher, slightly higher level, this group, than Europeans. But again, this is a pattern of delay incorporation. The level that they have when they enter actually doesn't change in the middle years with time in the US. It only begins to change after many years in the US, and the pattern remains once we control for socioeconomic characteristics, and that's not completely accounted by selectivity factors. In the case of Indian women and Korean and Southeast and other Asian women, again, here, very low levels of labor force participation when they arrive, very rapid growth with time in the US, and then it continues to grow after many years in the US, but the change is really in intermediate years. And socioeconomic characteristics actually does not explain this. It's really something like there's a national trait that explains a little bit, but really the disadvantages, even after we control for educational characteristics, remains there. And the Caribbean and Philippine women start very high, then they remain stagnant, and socioeconomic characteristics explain a little bit of that. Their high levels of education explain a little bit of that, but it's still there, and I changed very little with intermediate times in the US, and then it just remains stagnant. When we look at, these are the results for the role of educational attainment and English ability and family characteristics, is pretty much what you would expect. And women with less than high school education have a lower rate of labor force participation when they arrive, but they also suffer the penalty of much slower pattern of labor force incorporation in intermediate times in the US. Mexican women fall into this pattern. Those arriving with college, they are much higher levels of labor force incorporation when they arrive to the US. And really, there's a huge advantage with a few years in the US that actually really increases labor force participation, and it just remains standard. Not being able to speak English, it really affects the early labor force incorporation, and it's something that really puts women at disadvantage immediately after arriving to the US. Marriage, again, has an effect of having children in the family, has an effect of really preventing women from working immediately after they arrive to the US, but then it begins to increase with time in the US, and this group slowly increases the labor force participation with time in the US. Now I'm going to turn to the role of the gender characteristics of the migration flow and how they affect this. This is, I estimate first an overall effect, then I differentiate the effect at arrival, medium term, and longer term. The sex ratio at arrival, again, it can be interpreted as a measure of the network of resources that women can tap on to find jobs. And it also affects the kind of workers that employers recruit and who people can think. So it's an indirect measure of that composition of the flow. It really, when men are overrepresented in the flow, it really lowers the likelihood of women working overall, especially when they arrive. Also, in the medium term and in the longer term, it appears to have some compensating effect. But again, this is the experience of Mexican women, that you know the hard time entering the labor market and the hard time making progress over time. The percent of women arriving single, again, is an indicator of women just coming to the US, not following their husband, and very likely due to an economic motivation to migration, as migration as a way of finding better opportunities. It really increases the likelihood of overall being in the labor force. The effect is really powerful at arrival. So this is when the proportion of women arriving single creates a context where women can find jobs immediately after arriving, and it remains, and the effect really doesn't change at different points of being in the US. It becomes slightly negative, you know, at the end. The percent of women, the percent of the flow of men in the flow that arrive with college, again, is a measure of the resources that spouses can have and that can help support the family, and then it might reduce the push for women to participate in the labor force. And it doesn't appear to have an overall effect, but it does have a very clear effect at arrival, and then it sort of reverses. When women arrive to the US in a context where men are highly educated and making money, then the emphasis to work immediately after arrival is reduced, and it grows later. Indian women are in this group, and it's sort of explains a little bit of what happens in the Indian case. This is we model when we put everything together. This is like a bivariate, just one variable at a time. Here we put all the variables together, and the patterns tend to remain consistent. And the percent single actually is very closely connected to the sex ratio at arrival. So these effects sort of cancel out. And this is one of the difficulties in introducing aggregate level results in these models, because some of these things tend to be correlated and it's difficult to separate one from the other. So just to conclude, let me stress that regardless of nativity, most immigrant women eventually join the US workforce. In some cases, they do it at a rate that's even higher than what you see among US-born white women. Women economics contribution should be more systematically incorporated into our stories of immigrant assimilation and differences by national origin groups. We find 5 patterns of workforce incorporation. One is the gradual, that they start at mid-levels and then progressive growth, and they reaches 80%. Here you have Europe, Africa, China, Vietnam, Canada. That kind of this is especially the European experience has been the norm for understanding U.S. immigrants, the immigrant experience in the U.S. Mexico is a pattern of its own. It's a very peculiar migration flow. They start very low levels of labor force participation and very stagnant and early growth, and it never reaches 80%. But by the end, by many years, Mexican women are participating at a rate of 55–60% in the labor force, contributing to the family economy and being a key resource for the incorporation of Mexican immigrants. Then we have a delay, we have intercept. This is somewhat similar to the Mexico case, except that they start much higher level, and it might be affected by women migrating more single and on their own. And but still, this is something that they don't achieve parity with US-born white women or with European immigrants. We have this unique pattern of very low levels when they arrive, but then very rapid early growth. This is India, Korea, and other Asian countries, where it's a very unique experience for women, and it's very much connected with the immigration of men and the educational qualifications of the partners of Indian and Korean women. And then we have a group of women, which is really, this is the typical immigrant that gets assumed for the male experience. Is the immigrant that comes to the US to work. It's recruited by employers and by industries. Filipino women are the extreme case. Caribbean women, it's also connected with issues of family separation and much higher proportion migrating single. And but they start very high levels, 70%, and progressive growth. Human capital facilitates into incorporation of the labor force, higher starting levels of labor force participation for women that come with education, except for the cases of Indian and Korean women, but then higher growth rates. Accounts for low levels of labor participation among disadvantaged higher levels of labor force participation among Indian, Korean, and other Asian women, given their educational background. Family responsibilities hinder labor force participation. The role is smaller than human capital. Human capital is a key determinant of these things, but it does connect with low levels of labor force participation of Mexican, Indian, Korean, and other Asian women. Gender-specific Cohort characteristics upon arrival explain important share of national origin variation in incorporation, the sex ratio at arrival, the proportion of women migrating single, the educational qualification of the spouses. These are factors that need to be considered when we think about differences in the labor market trajectories of immigrant women. These indicates suggest the importance of structural forces, gender labor demand, immigration policy in explaining part of residual that in many cases, sometimes these forces gets attributed to culture. And here we are making the case for the importance of these structural characteristics over cultural traits, even though we're not really measuring cultural traits, but there is these differences that do play a key role in affecting labor force participation. And in terms of discussion, migration is increasingly being recognized, and not just an individual level phenomenon, but it's a household level decision. And it involves negotiations between partners. It involves a strategy, even if it's not among partners, is among other members of the households. And we need to pay attention about really how households connect with household dynamics, connects with issues of incorporation. Especially, we need to incorporate women's economic contributions into understandings of immigrant incorporations. There are still many papers out there that limit their analysis just to men, and just because men are easier to understand, and they still being considered like the driving force behind migration. Men are expected to come to the U.S., work, and so forth. The dynamics of female migration are more complex, but we need to pay more attention to that because they are obviously a very important contributor to the success of the immigrant experience. This is not just men who make this group successful, it's also women. But we have to recognize that the forces, especially contextual forces affecting immigrants, women, labor markets, might differ from men, and so we need to specify and think about what are these different contextual forces and what are the different dynamics of migration that might affect women that might not apply to men, what extends to both groups, and what we need to be thinking about differently and truly have a gender perspective when we look at these things. Ideally, and this is something that undergirds and is behind many of these national origin differences, that has to do with visa status. And lack of documentation comes to mind as a factor that can be affecting Mexican women and Central American women, their chances of being incorporated into the labor force. Lack of papers is obviously a restriction on being able to participate in the labor force. But there are other factors that we also need to consider. For instance, the H-1B visa holders that were, the H-1B visa, the spouse of H-1B visa faces all sorts of restrictions on labor force participation, and the experience of Indian and Korean women might actually be affected by visa holders. If you think about immigration policy and you think about taking advantage of the economic contribution of immigrants in the labor force, maybe we should revisit some of those restrictions for H-1B spouses of H-1B visa holders, so that they can easily incorporate the labor markets. It appears that it tends to happen with time in the US, but there's a high penalty during the first years in the US. So looking into the future, this sort of longitudinal approach, cross-national comparison, and hopefully having more detailed information about issues such as visa and how people arrive to the US will give us a more comprehensive picture of their labor market trajectories. Okay, that's all I have for today. Thank you very much.